Here is a number the Trump administration does not want you to hear. We are talking about a potential $1 trillion price tag on a war that was sold to the American public as a swift, decisive, and relatively contained military operation. And now, and this is where it gets truly alarming, the administration is floating the idea of criminal prosecution against anyone who dares to put that real number in front of you. A sitting United States senator, an academic economist, potentially anyone with a platform and a conscience. Well, let's build the case, piece by piece, because the evidence is already on the table, and it is damning. Let's start with what we actually know. The Pentagon put out an official figure for the cost of its military operation against Iran, publicly referred to as Operation Epic Fury. That number? $25 billion.
So approximately at this day, we're spending about $25 billion on Operation Epic Fury. Most of that is munitions. There's part of that is obviously O&M and equipment.
Now, to be clear, $25 billion is not pocket change. That is an enormous sum of taxpayer money. But according to independent economic analysis and statements from U.S. senators who sat through classified Pentagon briefings, that $25 billion figure covers only the most narrow, surface-level costs. We're talking missile fired, aircraft sorties flown, and direct equipment losses. What it does not account for is the cascading economic damage that is now radiating outward across the United States economy and global markets. It does not account for the long-term strategic cost of depleting weapons, stockpiles that will take years to replenish. It does not account for what happens to United States credibility and deterrence power when adversaries, particularly China, look at our magazines and see they are nearly empty. And it absolutely does not account for what is happening at the Strait of Hormuz, one of the single most critical oil choke points on the planet, through which roughly 20% of the world's daily petroleum supply moves. Reports suggest Iran has significantly expanded its posture of influence over those shipping lanes in the aftermath of this conflict. The full strategic implications of that are still developing, but what is already clear is that the $25 billion number is, at best, incomplete. At worst, it is a deliberate misrepresentation of reality. And here's the kicker. When Congress asked Budget Director Russell Vought, the man whose literal job it is to know these numbers, what the war actually cost, his answer was jaw-dropping. The director of the Office of Management and Budget. No ballpark for a war the United States just fought. Let that sink in for a moment because we are just getting started. Now here is where the first piece of hard evidence enters the room. According to CBS News anchor Margaret Brennan, after receiving a classified Pentagon briefing on the Iran war's direct impact on U.S. weapons stockpiles, Senator Mark Kelly stated, and this quote is on your screen right now, "It is shocking how deep we have gone into the magazines." For those who need context on who Mark Kelly is, this is not a career politician making a partisan talking point. This is a retired U.S. Navy combat aviator, a former NASA astronaut, and a sitting U.S. senator from Arizona who sat inside a classified Pentagon briefing room and heard, in detail, what this operation cost us in terms of military readiness. And what he heard shocked him. He specifically named the weapon systems that have been severely depleted.
Have you gotten an answer on how depleted U.S. munitions are?
Yes, Margaret, we have. We've been tracking it. A number of times we've been briefed by the Pentagon on specific munitions. Actually, it's been pretty detailed on Tomahawks, ATACMS, SM-3s, THAAD rounds, Patriot rounds, so those interceptor rounds to defend ourselves. And the numbers are, I think it's fair to say it's shocking.
Right there, straight from the source. Tomahawk cruise missiles, ATACMS, SM-3 interceptors, THAAD rounds, Patriot interceptor rounds. These are not minor, easily replaceable items. These are the backbone of America's ability to defend itself and project power globally. And Kelly made something else explicit in that briefing. He said it will take years to replenish what was spent in roughly 40 days of operation. And here's where this stops being a budget story and becomes a national security crisis. If the United States were to face a military confrontation in the Western Pacific with China right now, our depleted stockpiles would be a direct and serious liability. Think about what adversaries who are watching through their own intelligence channels now understand about U.S. military readiness. This is not a political talking point. This is a verified alarm bell from someone who was in the room. Now, here is where the story takes a turn that goes beyond military strategy and lands squarely in the territory of democratic norms and constitutional law. Because the administration's response to Senator Kelly going public was not to dispute the facts. It was to threaten him. Look at what is on your screen right now. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth posting publicly on X, calling Kelly Captain Mark Kelly. Senator Kelly's actual military rank was colonel. That is not a minor slip. That is a calculated attempt to diminish the credibility of a man who just walked out of a classified briefing with information the American public has a right to understand. Now look at that second phrase, Department of War, legal counsel, not the Department of Defense. That deliberate language signals something about how this administration views its own mandate and its relationship to congressional oversight. And then there's the threat itself. The administration is floating a legal review against a sitting U.S. senator for disclosing information from a congressional briefing, a briefing that Congress requested as part of its constitutional oversight function. Legal scholars have long recognized that the speech or debate clause of the U.S. Constitution provides members of Congress significant protections for legislative activities, including oversight functions. Whether Kelly's disclosure crosses any legal line is a genuine legal question, but the act of threatening prosecution as a response to congressional oversight is a democratic institution's alarm bell. And Senator Kelly is apparently not the only target. Reports suggest the administration has signaled that economists and analysts who publicly discuss figures referenced in classified briefings could also face scrutiny. To be precise, no formal criminal referral has been publicly confirmed as of this recording. But the message being sent is unmistakable. Discuss the real costs of this war, and we will come after you. But the threats did not stop the evidence from getting out. Because here, this one comes with receipts from one of the most credentialed economists in the country. University of Michigan professor of economics and public policy Justin Wolfers published this op-ed in the New York Times, and then the investigative outlet Dropsite News broke down his findings point by point. The conclusion? The Pentagon's $25 billion figure is not just an undercount. According to Wolfers' analysis, the true cost runs into the hundreds of billions and very possibly trillions. Let's walk through this together. Geopolitical risk. Federal Reserve economists estimate that a spike in tension of this scale carries an economic cost of approximately $200 billion and could leave roughly 1 million fewer Americans employed within a single year. That is from economists at the Federal Reserve. Interest rates. With rate cuts now effectively off the table, the Fed's likely policy response could cost the U.S. economy another $200 billion in lost economic output. And elevated bond yields on 10, are sure, and 30-year treasuries mean the federal government pays significantly more in interest on its debt every single year going forward. We are talking about a compounding cost that builds over decades. The stock market. Wolfers estimates the conflict has wiped approximately $3 trillion off S&P 500 valuations. Oil prices elevated through at least 2028. U.S. markets lagging significantly behind foreign markets during this period, meaning American retirement accounts. Pension funds and household wealth have absorbed damage that did not have to happen. GDP growth. Goldman Sachs projects U.S. GDP growth will be 0.5 percentage points lower as a direct result of this conflict, approximately $400 billion in lost income for American workers and businesses over the next 2 years. And then there is the defense budget itself. The administration's FY 2027 request $1.5 trillion, a 40% increase, roughly $4,000 per American household. Journalist Ryan Grimm put it simply, and that tweet is on your screen right now. $1 trillion defense budget, nearly out of ammunition in roughly 40 days. And the proposed solution is to bump the budget to $2.5 trillion. The math is not complicated. The accountability is simply absent. So what did Senator Kelly do when he had the opportunity to address this $1.5 trillion request in a public forum? He did not hedge. He did not equivocate.
When it comes to making America ready to defend our allies and ourselves, Does what you described basically make it impossible for a Democrat like yourself to say no to that request from the White House for $1.5 trillion in defense spending?
Well, first of all, let me just back up a second. Things like this, nothing is inevitable. There are always other options. During the Obama administration, the Iran deal, the JCPOA kept the enrichment at a lower level. Donald Trump tore that up. That's the reason we're here. But this also was not inevitable. There were other things that we could do. The $1.5 trillion request from this administration, it's outrageous. When I got to the Senate 5.5 years ago, the defense budget was just over $700 billion. Now they're asking for twice as much money. It's nearly the amount that the rest of the world pays for its defense.
So
and as I pointed out,
there it is. From a man who flew combat missions and piloted spacecraft, the $1.5 trillion request is outrageous. And the context he provided matters enormously. When Kelly arrived in the Senate 5 years ago, the defense budget stood at just over $700 billion. The current request would more than double that figure in half a decade, and it would represent a budget nearly equal to what the entire rest of the world combined spends on its own defense. Kelly also made a point that deserves its own moment of attention. He raised the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal that kept Iran's uranium enrichment at significantly lower, monitored levels. The Trump administration withdrew from that agreement in 2018. Kelly's argument, stated clearly on national television, is that the conditions leading to this military conflict were not inevitable. There were diplomatic pathways that were deliberately abandoned. The JCPOA withdrawal is documented, verifiable historical fact. And then there is the Golden Dome. The administration included funding for a sweeping missile defense architecture covering the Western Hemisphere in this budget request. Kelly, with actual aerospace and physics credentials, said the physics of building such a system at the geographic scale and complexity of the continental United States is really, really hard. His on-the-record assessment, enormous sums of money spent on a system that will likely not perform as advertised. That is the opinion of a former combat aviator and NASA astronaut, not a partisan attack line. Now, here is where we need to zoom out, because there is a pattern here that goes beyond any single policy decision. And the next piece of evidence illustrates it in a way that is almost hard to believe until you watch it yourself.
And by the way, yesterday I sold 1,000.
Oh, you did? I got a poly market I created on how many of you guys going to sell this. And how many people do you think there are that could qualify in the world?
There are 37 million people in the world who are capable of buying the card.
That's
in case you were wondering.
37 million. That's a lot more than ChatGPT told me.
Who are capable of buying it.
Who are capable of buying it.
Now, I'm not saying they will, but they're capable of buying.
How many do you think you'll sell?
The president thinks we can sell 1 million.
So
That's
$5 trillion.
I think 1 million is
$5 trillion from a visa program with no verified demand data, no independent economic modeling, and no explanation of how 37 million capable buyers becomes 1 million actual buyers. And this is the same administration that has publicly floated $18 trillion and $21 trillion in projected revenue from trade deals and tariff policies, figures that independent economists have consistently challenged as dramatically overstated. Here is the strategic logic. Follow it carefully. When you flood the public with enormous, unverifiable numbers on the revenue side, it becomes much harder to track the real numbers on the cost side. A $3 trillion loss in stock market value starts to sound like just another big number when you have been hearing $5 trillion and $21 trillion for months. Number fatigue is not an accident. It is a feature of this information environment. And then there is this. The Secretary of Defense, the man asking Congress for $1.5 trillion, used a portion of that budget hearing not to address weapons depletion or strategic readiness, but to make a different kind of argument entirely.
I haven't talked about it as much in these hearings because this is a budget hearing about $1.5 trillion that's historic and significant. But underwriting the change that we've seen at our department was a laser focus on getting back to basics. And the key word to that is merit. We had a department that was obsessed with gender, ideology, and race, diversity, equity, and inclusion. In fact, the mantra you would hear dripping from the lips of generals and with a serious look on their face was, "Our diversity is our strength," which is the single dumbest phrase in military history.
That was the Secretary of Defense in a $1.5 trillion budget hearing, with empty weapons magazines, with depleted interceptor stockpiles, with a China conflict scenario on the horizon. That is what received his emphasis. Let that speak for itself. Let's bring this all the way home because the stakes here extend far beyond one military operation or one budget request. What we are looking at is the convergence of 4 serious crises happening simultaneously, and the question of whether the American public has access to accurate information about any of them. You have a military readiness crisis documented by a sitting senator with security clearance that has left U.S. weapons stockpiles severely depleted at a moment when geopolitical tensions with China in the Western Pacific are at some of their highest levels in decades. You have an economic accountability crisis documented by Federal Reserve economists, Goldman Sachs, and a credentialed University of Michigan professor that is costing American households in their paychecks, their retirement accounts, and their daily expenses. And that is not reflected anywhere in the official government cost figure. You have a fiscal transparency crisis documented by the OMB director's own admission that he has no ballpark figure for the war's cost. And you have a democratic accountability crisis documented by the Secretary of Defense's own public post in which the administration is floating criminal prosecution threats against a U.S. senator and potentially academic economists for discussing information the public needs to make informed decisions. Here is the geopolitical reality that ties all of this together. The Strait of Hormuz matters to global oil markets. Global oil markets matter to inflation. Inflation matters to Federal Reserve interest rate decisions. Interest rate decisions matter to the bond market. The bond market matters to how much the United States pays on its national debt every single year. And the national debt matters to every single program, military and civilian, that the federal government funds. These are not separate stories. They are one story. And the through line of that story is a fundamental question about whether the institutions designed to provide accountability, Congress, the free press, independent academia, are being allowed to do their jobs. Senator Kelly saw it in the briefing room. Professor Wolfers ran the numbers. Goldman Sachs published its projections. The OMB director admitted he has no answer. And the Secretary of Defense sent a public threat to a U.S. senator rather than disputing a single underlying fact. Every one of those data points is verifiable. Every one of them is sourced. And every one of them points in the same direction. When a government moves to prosecute the people exposing its costs, the most important question is no longer how much the war cost. The most important question is, what are they still hiding? Like and subscribe to stay informed. Cross-reference everything. And never let the volume of numbers, real or invented, drown out the ones that actually matter.